Everything you think you know about surviving winter indoors is built on a lie. Your house, with its insulated walls, its smart thermostat, its double-pane windows, its furnace humming away in the basement, connected to a fuel truck that comes when you call, cannot do what a 10 by 12-foot log box built in 2 weeks by half-frozen trappers could do in the winter of 1839. Not even close. Those men spent entire winters in the Rocky Mountains at temperatures that would kill a modern person in hours, and they did it without a single thing you would find at a hardware store today. No fiberglass batting, no spray foam, no vapor barrier, no building inspector. What they built was not impressive by the standards of modern architecture. It was something far more dangerous than impressive. It was something that actually worked. And the principles behind it, the real ones, not the Hollywood version, have been sitting in forgotten journals for nearly 200 years, waiting for someone to take them seriously. Let me introduce you to Osborne Russell. He was 20 years old when he first entered the Rocky Mountains in 1834, working as a trapper for Nathaniel Wyeth's Columbia River Fishing and Trading Company. By the winter of 1839, he had become one of the most experienced American wilderness men alive, and he recorded exactly what winter quarters looked like in his Journal of a Trapper, a manuscript that sat essentially unpublished for over a century before the University of Nebraska Press finally put it into the world in 1965. Russell wrote that the men had snug lodges made of dressed buffalo skins, in the center of which we built a fire, and generally comprised about 6 men to the lodge. 6 men, 1 fire, a hide teepee pitched deliberately in the shelter of a cottonwood river-bottom grove where the horses could strip bark to stay alive through the deepest months. He called it, completely without irony, the Rocky Mountain College. These men debated, argued, philosophized, and told stories until midnight in what he described as perfect good humor, not suffering, not barely clinging to life, thriving, in the dead of a Rocky Mountain winter that dropped to 30 below zero without apology. And here is the question that should stop you cold right now. How? How does a group of men with no insulation, no furnace, no building code, and no hardware store spend an entire winter at altitude and come out the other side healthy, warm, and apparently in excellent spirits? What did they know that we've forgotten? Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been inside a modern cabin, a vacation rental, a well-built house where the heating system ran all night and you still woke up cold, where despite the thermostat on the wall and the electricity in the meter and all the technology money could buy, something just fundamentally wasn't right? Drop that experience in the comments below, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about the relationship between shelter, heat, and the survival of a human body in winter. It is not about the technology. It never was. Walk into a modern prefab cabin today and tell me what you see. You'll see RR19 fiberglass bats stuffed between 2x6 studs, spaced 16 inches on center. You'll see a plastic vapor barrier stapled over that. A thin sheet of polyethylene designed to control moisture movement. You'll see oriented strandboard sheathing on the outside, then house wrap, then vinyl siding that flexes and gaps in the cold. You'll see a propane furnace connected to a thermostat that bleeds warmth through every electrical outlet, every recessed light, every gap where a pipe enters the wall cavity. The building inspector signed off on it. The contractor guaranteed it met code. And when the power goes out at 40 below and the fuel truck can't get up your road, it becomes a beautiful, compliant, perfectly useless box that will kill you in 3 days. Meanwhile, Osborne Russell and 5 other men slept warm in a structure with no insulation rating at all, no mechanical heat, no utility bills, no truck, and they did it for an entire winter without losing a single man to the cold. So what precisely is going wrong with our modern version? Here's where it gets important, and here is the part that should genuinely make you angry. The shift from what actually worked to what we build today was not driven by a desire to keep people warmer. It was driven by the economics of scale, specifically the economics of building hundreds of thousands of identical houses as fast and cheaply as possible in the post-war boom years of the late 1940s and 1950s. The construction industry standardized around 2x4 and 2x6 framing because it was fast and required minimal skill. Around fiberglass insulation because it could be manufactured cheaply and stapled into a stud bay by workers who needed no training. Around forced air heating because ductwork could be installed by semi-skilled crews in a single afternoon. These decisions were made by people optimizing for cost per unit and construction speed, not for the actual physics of keeping a human body warm when the grid goes down and the truck doesn't come. And then they turned around and told you that anything outside their system was backward, that log walls were inefficient, that open fires were wasteful, that the old ways were the ways of people who simply hadn't discovered better yet. They had. We just stopped listening. And the failure since then has not been yours. The instructions were wrong from the beginning. Let's go layer by layer through what mountain men actually understood and what building science has now confirmed they got right. Because this is not folklore, this is physics. And it's been sitting in peer-reviewed engineering documents and forgotten trapper journals alike for anyone willing to put the two together. The first and most powerful principle is this: volume is everything. A 10 by 12 foot cabin with a 7-foot ceiling contains roughly 840 cubic feet of air. A modern 2,000 square foot house contains somewhere between 15,000 and 18,000 cubic feet. Think about what that means in practice. 4 men sharing that small mountain cabin are each producing approximately 100 watts of body heat continuously. That is the established figure from ASHRAE's Handbook of Fundamentals, the engineering standard that governs the entire heating and cooling industry in North America. 4 bodies in 840 cubic feet is a meaningful, measurable heat source. 4 bodies in 16,000 cubic feet are a rounding error that the furnace barely notices. The mountain men were not just sharing space out of social necessity or because they lacked alternatives. They were engineering a heating system out of human biology itself. Every additional man in that lodge was another 100 continuous watts of free warmth. No fuel, no machinery, no utility bill. Just the elegant physics of warm-blooded animals in a small enclosed space. The second principle is air sealing, and this is where the modern version fails most completely and most expensively. A 6-inch softwood log wall delivers roughly R8 of thermal resistance. That has been confirmed by the USDA Forest Products Laboratory and referenced in the Department of Energy's guidance on log home energy efficiency. A modern 2x6 stud wall, properly insulated, delivers R20. On paper, the modern wall wins easily. But here is what the paper never tells you. Research from Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the work of building scientist Joseph Listeburek has established that air leakage, the invisible, continuous movement of cold outside air through gaps, cracks, and penetrations, can account for 10 to 42% of a building's total heat loss and can functionally cut a wall's installed insulation value nearly in half. Modern houses leak steadily through every wire penetration, every plumbing chase, as every gap where the vapor barrier was stapled in a hurry on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Now, think carefully about what chinking and daubing actually were. Chinking was wood wedges, split sticks, moss, and bark packed firmly into every gap between log courses. Daubing was clay or mud mixed with grass, straw, or animal hair, slathered over the chinking and across the entire exterior wall surface, and allowed to cure hard. When it dried properly, it formed a near-continuous shell, something close to a ceramic wind barrier, wrapped around the entire structure. Those trappers were not trying to insulate their walls. They were eliminating air movement through them entirely. And that, not the R value, not the stud spacing, not the vapor barrier, was the thing that actually kept them alive. Here's where it gets more remarkable. They didn't stop at the walls. Snow did the rest of the work for free. Building science has long established that settled, compacted snow carries an insulation value of roughly RR1 per inch of depth, 30 inches of natural drift piled against a cabin wall, which happens automatically in any sheltered forest hollow where wind eddies deposit snow against the first solid object it finds, delivers R30 of insulation that also seals every chinking crack the wind managed to exploit over the previous week. The cabin does not just sit in the snow. It wears the snow. It becomes thermally continuous with the landscape itself. And this is why site selection was not an afterthought for these men. It was the first decision they made. Osborne Russell, Warren Ferris, Rufus Sage. Every memoir of every trapper who successfully wintered in the mountains describes the same instinctive choice. A river-bottom cottonwood or aspen grove on the sheltered south or east face of a valley, low enough in elevation to catch heavy snow without being swept clean by the wind, with the trees dense enough to break the prevailing cold air movement before it ever reached the lodge. They chose the land the way a modern engineer chooses a wall section, because getting it wrong was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The third principle is thermal mass, and it is the one that modern construction has most thoroughly and quietly abandoned. A solid log wall is not just a barrier, it is a battery. During the hours when a fire burns hot, the logs absorb heat into their mass, hundreds of pounds of wood slowly drinking in warmth from the interior air. When the fire burns low at 3 in the morning, those logs release that stored heat back into the room gradually and continuously. The temperature does not crash. It drifts. It holds. Think of it as the difference between a cast iron pan and a thin aluminum skillet. Both heat up over the same flame, but only one of them keeps cooking after you remove it from the heat source. A modern stud wall with a bat of fiberglass between two sheets of OSB has almost no thermal mass at all. The moment the furnace cycles off, the wall is cold within minutes. The mountain man woke up cool sometimes in the small hours, but he rarely woke up in danger. And then there is the fireplace itself, which was, in engineering terms, the least efficient part of the entire system, and which the mountain men compensated for in ways that were as simple as they were brilliant. An open masonry hearth, according to the EPA, operates at roughly 10 to 15% efficiency. 85% of the energy in the wood goes up the flue. The men answered this with two moves that required no technology at all. They slept within the cone of radiant heat thrown by the fire. And radiant heat, unlike convective heat, does not warm air first and then warm you. It warms surfaces directly, your skin, your sleeping body, regardless of what the ambient air temperature is doing 6 feet away. And they kept stones in the coals all evening, wrapped them in cloth or hide, and took them into the bedroll, a practice that Dick Proenneke, who built his own cabin entirely alone at Twin Lakes, Alaska in 1968, using hand tools he had largely made himself, still used well over a century later, calling his two bed-warming rocks "my girls." The cat and clay chimney that settler builders used, a wooden frame stacked outside the gable end wall, plastered inside and out with clay reinforced with grass fiber, deliberately built leaning away from the structure, was designed to be knocked off the wall with a pole if it caught fire, rebuilt in a day with materials found within 200 yards of the cabin and back in service before nightfall. It was not efficient by any modern measure, but it was self-repairing with zero dependency on anything beyond human skill and available clay. When your furnace fails in February, tell me how long the repair takes. So why did we walk away from all of this? 3 reasons. And they stack on each other in a way that should feel familiar. Speed first. A saddle-notched log cabin built by 4 experienced men takes roughly 2 weeks of full-day labor. A prefab panel wall system goes up in an afternoon. When the post-war housing industry needed to produce hundreds of thousands of structures in years rather than generations, 2 weeks of skilled labor per structure was economically impossible. The old method required genuine craft, reading timber for straightness and taper, cutting a notch that would lock under compression, mixing daubing to a consistency that would cure without cracking. You cannot train that in a weekend. The industry could not afford to pay for it. Cost second. The labor cost of real log construction has always been prohibitive at industrial scale. A craftsman who could hand hew and dovetail notch a truly tight log corner was an artisan, and artisans set their own prices. Fiberglass and oriented strand board require none of that skill and a fraction of that time, and the savings per unit were large enough that the industry adopted them with a speed that left no room for second thoughts about what was being discarded. And third, cheap energy made thermal mass invisible as a benefit. When natural gas was abundant and inexpensive, there was no financial penalty for a building that shed all its stored heat the moment the burner cycled off. You turned the thermostat up and burned more gas, the thermal flywheel that a log wall provided. That slow, generous release of stored warmth through the night became, from the industry's perspective, an unnecessary complication. It was engineered out. And now energy is expensive again. And now the reliability of the grid is a question that serious people are asking out loud in ways they were not 10 years ago. And the solid log wall is still there in the journals and in the surviving cabins, doing exactly what it always did. It did not change. We did. Now, here is what you can actually do starting today. And I am giving you 3 options in order from easiest to most involved. Option 1 costs nothing and requires no tools. Reduce your heated volume. Close off rooms you are not occupying. Hang a heavy blanket or a thick curtain across doorways between the heated space and unused areas. Heat the room you live in, not the house you are paying for. This is the most direct inheritance from Russell's Rocky Mountain College. 6 bodies in 840 cubic feet, and it will produce a measurable difference in your comfort and your heating cost within 24 hours. No purchase necessary, no installation, just the physics of small heated volumes that these men understood intuitively and that we have been trained to ignore by the industry that profits from our heating the hallway. Option 2 takes a Saturday morning and costs under $50. Get a stick of incense and walk it slowly around every electrical outlet on your exterior walls, every window frame, every place where a pipe or wire enters your home. Watch the smoke carefully. Wherever it bends sideways and pulls toward the wall, you are losing heat through an air leak that no amount of insulation can compensate for. A foam backer rod, latex caulk, and adhesive weather stripping will address the large majority of what you find, and you will feel the difference the same night. This is the modern equivalent of daubing, hands-on, inexpensive, and more impactful on your actual winter comfort than adding another inch of fiberglass to a leaking shell ever could be. Option 3 is for those planning a new build, a renovation, or a retreat property. Study your site before you study anything else. South or east-facing exposure for maximum winter sun on your primary wall and entrance. A topographic feature, a hillside, a ridge, a dense stand of conifers between your structure and the prevailing north and west winds. A compact footprint that keeps your heated volume small relative to your envelope. These decisions cost nothing at the planning stage and cannot be corrected after the foundation is set. The mountain men did not have building science. They had observation, consequence, and the clear-eyed understanding that the land itself was a structural element. They were right. Use that knowledge now, when getting it wrong costs money instead of your life. Osborne Russell was not a primitive man stumbling through the wilderness on instinct and luck. He was an engineer working with the materials his environment provided, solving a problem that killed the careless and ignored the arrogant, deploying principles of physics he understood through years of observation, even though he had no language of R values or thermal mass to name them. He was a master, and the system he and men like Warren Ferris, Rufus Sage, and Zenas Leonard used across the Mountain West was not a desperate collection of improvisations. It was a complete, integrated, self-repairing architecture of survival, one that cost nothing but skill, attention, and willingness to read the land honestly. The knowledge was never lost. It was traded away, exchanged deliberately for speed and scale and the quiet profit of dependency, and then buried under the assumption that newer always means better. We are digging up exactly this kind of knowledge on this channel. The methods, the systems, the principles that worked before the industry decided your convenience was less important than your reliance on their supply chain. Subscribe if that is the kind of information you came here for. And tell us in the comments, what is the next piece of forgotten knowledge you want us to go find?